May 6th, 1945. The rain was falling over Reims, France, turning the dust of the ruined city into a slick gray mud. Inside a cramped red brick schoolhouse that served as the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, the air was thick with cigarette smoke and nervous tension. A German general walked into Dwight Eisenhower's headquarters with a proposal so extraordinary, so audacious, that it threatened to upend the entire geopolitical map of the 20th century before the ink on the peace treaties could even dry. General Alfred Jodl, the chief of operations for the German High Command, had arrived that evening. He was a man who had stood by Hitler's side, planning the conquest of Europe. But tonight, he was a man looking for a lifeboat. He was accompanied by Admiral Hans-Georg von Friedeberg, a man who looked visibly broken, having just failed to negotiate a separate peace with British Field Marshal Montgomery 2 days earlier on the windswept Lüneburg Heath. They carried a new offer, one authorized by the crumbling remains of the German government. Germany was prepared to surrender to the United States and Great Britain immediately. Every soldier, every Tiger tank, every Messerschmitt aircraft remaining on the Western Front would lay down arms. The guns would fall silent. But there was a condition that revealed the terrifying reality of the German psyche in 1945. Germany wanted to keep fighting the Soviet Union. Not just keep fighting. They wanted American fuel in their tanks, American supplies in their trucks, and American air cover overhead. The German High Command was effectively proposing a grand alliance. Yesterday's mortal enemies were being asked to join forces against the Red Army. Standing before Eisenhower's skeptical staff, General Jodl made the case with the precision of a lawyer and the desperation of a condemned man. The Soviets, he argued, were the true threat to Western civilization. Germany had been the bulwark holding back the Asiatic hordes for 4 years. If America helped them continue, or at least turned a blind eye, the Wehrmacht could stop Stalin at the current lines. Eisenhower's response to this proposal would not just decide the fate of the war, it would shape the next 50 years of human history. To understand why Jodl believed this offer might be accepted, we must look back 6 days. Adolf Hitler had shot himself in his Berlin bunker on April 30th, leaving behind a nation in ashes. His designated successor was not a fanatic from the SS or a party politician, but Admiral Karl Dönitz, the commander of the German Navy. Dönitz was a pragmatic military man who saw himself primarily as a naval officer, distinct from the political machinery of the Nazi Party. Whatever his views on ideology, he possessed a cold, calculating rationality. He had watched Germany's strategic position collapse over 4 years of brutal conflict. Dönitz inherited a nightmare that is difficult to comprehend. Berlin had fallen to the Soviets, reduced to a pile of rubble and corpses. American and Soviet forces had famously linked up at the Elbe River, physically cutting the Third Reich in two. Millions of German soldiers were trapped in pockets across Europe, in Courland, in Bohemia, in Italy, with nowhere to go. Communications were severed, supply lines were non-existent. Dönitz understood one thing with absolute clarity. The war was lost. Germany could not win. There was no secret weapon, no miracle counterattack coming to save them. But amidst the ruin, Dönitz realized he still had one card left to play. Germany could not choose whether it lost, but perhaps it could choose who times it lost to. The difference between the two conquerors was stark and terrifying. Surrender to the Americans meant prisoner of war camps with Geneva Convention standards, eventual trials for the leadership, military occupation, and the slow process of rebuilding. It meant life. Surrender to the Soviets meant something entirely different. It meant systematic brutality, immediate execution for officers, deportation to Siberian labor camps, and what the Germans feared would be the permanent enslavement of their people. Dönitz made a calculated, cynical decision. He would try to surrender only to the West while continuing to fight with desperate fury in the East. This was not just a decision made by generals looking at maps. It was a reality understood by every single German soldier on the Eastern Front. They knew that Soviet captivity was a death sentence. The statistics tell a grim story. The Red Army had suffered 27 million dead fighting Germany. It was a war of annihilation. Soviet soldiers had marched all the way from Stalingrad to Berlin, liberating concentration camps along the way and witnessing German atrocities firsthand. They had seen the scorched earth, the mass graves, and the starving villages. By the time they reached German soil, revenge was not just permitted by their commanders, it was encouraged. German troops who surrendered to the Soviets faced summary execution on the spot, starvation in open-air camps where men resorted to cannibalism, or decades of forced labor in the gulags of Siberia. Of approximately 3 million German soldiers captured by the Red Army, historians estimate roughly 1 million died in captivity, a mortality rate exceeding 30%. In American or British hands, the mortality rate was under 3%. The math was simple, brutal, and undeniable. Surrender west or die east. So, the German army ran. It was a panic-fueled migration unlike anything seen in modern warfare. Entire divisions abandoned their defensive positions and marched west, ignoring orders to stand and fight, hoping to reach American lines before the Soviet pincers closed around them. They were not alone. German civilians, terrified by the tales of the Red Army's advance, did the same. Millions of refugees clogged the roads, fleeing the advancing Soviet steamroller. Women who had heard horrific stories of what happened in East Prussia, families pushing carts piled high with heirlooms, the elderly and the infirm all moving west. They could hear the rumble of Soviet artillery growing closer with each passing hour, a thunder that signaled the end of their world. For a mother huddled in a refugee wagon or a soldier shivering in a foxhole, every hour of negotiation in Reims wasn't abstract diplomacy. It was the difference between a life in the Western sphere of influence or a death in the frozen East. Dönitz's proposal to Eisenhower wasn't just grand strategy. It was the desperate calculation of a nation watching the clock run out, trying to save its biological existence. Dönitz's first attempt to split the Allies had come on May 4th. He had sent Admiral Hans-Georg von Friedeberg to British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's tactical headquarters at Lüneburg Heath. Von Friedeberg, looking exhausted and haggard, proposed exactly what Dönitz wanted. German forces in the north would surrender to the British, but he also wanted to include German forces facing the Soviets, specifically Army Group Vistula, which was currently fighting a losing battle in the east. He argued that if they surrendered to the British, they would be saved from the Russians. Montgomery, a man known for his prickly demeanor and strict adherence to protocol, accepted part of the offer. He took the surrender of roughly 1 million German troops in Holland, northwest Germany, and Denmark. This was a massive victory, but he refused to touch the Eastern Front. He saw the trap. He knew that accepting the surrender of troops fighting the Soviets would violate the agreements made between the Allied powers. No separate deals that excluded the Soviets. The tactical surrender was signed, but the larger proposal, the salvation of the Eastern Army, was dead. Dönitz received the news in Flensburg and didn't give up. If Montgomery wouldn't deal on the Eastern question, perhaps the Supreme Commander, Eisenhower, would. He sent a higher-ranking officer to try again. General Alfred Jodl flew to Reims on May 6th with von Friedeberg at his side. Jodl carried the same proposal, but he also carried something else: full authorization to negotiate. Alfred Jodl was one of the most senior officers in the German military. He had been Hitler's chief strategic advisor throughout the war, the man who translated the dictator's will into military orders. Now he sat across from Eisenhower's chief of staff, General Walter Bedell Smith, making Germany's case with a chilling calmness. The argument Jodl presented was straightforward and, from a certain perspective, logically sound. Germany could not survive Soviet occupation. Stalin's forces were already imposing communist dictatorships on Poland, Romania, and Hungary. They were dismantling factories, arresting intellectuals, and suppressing religion. They would do the same everywhere they occupied. Germany had been fighting the Soviets for 4 years. They knew the enemy better than anyone. German soldiers knew Soviet tactics, Soviet weaknesses, and Soviet supply vulnerabilities. Jodl argued that the Western Allies needed the Wehrmacht. If the West provided support, Germany could continue holding the eastern line, acting as a shield for Europe. Jodl proposed that German forces surrender to America and Britain while maintaining defensive positions against the Red Army. American supplies would keep them fighting. American air power would support them. The implication was clear. This wasn't just surrender. This was a proposal to switch sides in the middle of the apocalypse. Eisenhower never met with Jodl personally during these initial discussions. He refused to be in the same room with German officers until they accepted unconditional surrender. This refusal wasn't just professional protocol, it was deeply personal. 3 weeks earlier, Eisenhower had walked through the liberated Ohrdruf concentration camp. He had seen the stacked bodies, the cremation pits, and the walking skeletons who barely looked human anymore. The stench of death had been so overpowering that hardened soldiers vomited. Eisenhower had been so appalled that he ordered every American unit in the area to tour the camp and witness what the Nazi regime had done. He wanted to ensure that no one could ever claim these things hadn't happened. Now, generals from that very same regime were sitting in his headquarters, asking him for an alliance. The moral revulsion was visceral. To Eisenhower, the German military was not a potential partner. It was a criminal organization that had enabled the worst crimes in human history. But Eisenhower was also a pragmatist, and he understood the strategic argument Jodl was making. He understood why it was tempting, but he also understood why it was impossible. The United States was still fighting a brutal war against Japan in the Pacific. American military planners were counting on the Soviet Union to enter the Pacific War to help defeat the Japanese on the Asian mainland. Betraying Stalin in Europe would mean fighting Japan alone, potentially costing hundreds of thousands more American lives. Furthermore, the American public still saw the Soviets as heroic allies. For years, wartime propaganda had portrayed Uncle Joe Stalin as a friendly partner fighting the common fascist enemy. The idea of suddenly allying with Nazi Germany against the Russians would have caused political chaos at home. President Roosevelt had made binding agreements at Yalta regarding the division of Europe. The Soviets would occupy Eastern Europe. Germany would be divided into occupation zones. Breaking those agreements meant breaking America's word and shattering the international order before peace was even declared. And there was the most practical problem of all, the sheer power of the Red Army. The Soviet Union had 11 million men under arms, with roughly 6.5 million frontline troops in Europe alone. Their tanks were battle-hardened, their artillery was unmatched, and their morale was sky-high. If Eisenhower accepted the German proposal and Stalin kept fighting, the Red Army might not stop at Berlin. They might march to the Rhine, or even the Atlantic. The Western Allies had demobilization on their minds. The Soviets were fully mobilized for conquest. Eisenhower faced an impossible choice. Accept the German offer and risk starting World War III immediately against a juggernaut. Reject it and hand half of Europe to Stalin. He had just seen what one totalitarian regime did to millions of people in the camps. Now he was being asked to choose between confronting another totalitarian regime or abandoning millions more to its grip. Eisenhower's response to Jodl was delivered through General Smith, and it was cold as steel. It was not a negotiation, it was an ultimatum. Germany would surrender unconditionally to all times Allied powers, including the Soviet Union. All German forces on all fronts would cease fighting simultaneously. There would be no separate peace with the West. Then came the hammer blow. Eisenhower threatened that if Germany refused these terms, he would close the Western lines. This meant American and British forces would stop accepting German surrenders. They would physically block the roads. Every German soldier trying to flee west would be turned back directly into Soviet hands. Eisenhower gave Jodl a deadline. Accept by midnight on May 8th or face the consequences. Jodl, stunned by the severity of the threat, sent an urgent, encrypted message to Dönitz in Flensburg. Eisenhower is not bluffing, the message essentially read. The Americans were prepared to force German soldiers to surrender to the Soviets if Germany didn't accept unconditional terms. Dönitz faced the end of his strategy. The Western Allies would not save Germany from the Soviets. There would be no crusade against Stalin. The gamble had failed. However, not everyone in the American command thought Eisenhower was making the right choice. General George Patton, the fiery commander of the U.S. Third Army, had been warning about the Soviet threat for months. Patton was a man who saw history in broad, sweeping arcs. He had seen Red Army behavior in the areas where American and Soviet forces met: the looting, the raping, the aggressive posturing. He had read intelligence reports about widespread atrocities and deportations in Soviet-occupied territory. Patton was furious. He told anyone who would listen, often shouting in his headquarters, that the Americans had defeated the wrong enemy. Germany is broken, he argued. The Soviet Union is the real danger. Patton voiced the exact same strategic logic the Germans were voicing. He advocated rearming the Wehrmacht. Use German soldiers who know how to fight the Soviets, he suggested. Push Stalin back to the pre-war borders, while American forces are still at full strength. Patton argued that America would have to fight the Soviets. Eventually, it was inevitable. Better to do it now, he reasoned, with battle-hardened troops and air supremacy, than later when the Soviets had recovered. rebuilt their industry, and developed atomic weapons of their own. His superiors, and indeed the political leadership in Washington, told him to be quiet. Publicly advocating war with America's ally was career suicide and diplomatically disastrous. But Patton couldn't stay quiet. He felt the window of opportunity closing, and nobody in Washington seemed to care. He wasn't the only one thinking this way. Across the channel, Winston Churchill, always suspicious of Stalin, had ordered his military staff to draw up top-secret plans for attacking the Soviets. The plan was codenamed Operation Unthinkable. Churchill's planners proposed rearming 100,000 German soldiers, roughly 10 divisions, to fight alongside Allied forces in a surprise attack against the Red Army. The target date was July 1st, 1945. It was a plan born of fear and foresight. But when the British chiefs of staff looked at the numbers, they realized the folly of it. The Red Army outnumbered the Allies nearly 3-1 in Europe. Operation Unthinkable was deemed militarily impossible. The German proposal wasn't just Nazi desperation, it was the same strategic logic that Western military leaders were secretly considering behind closed doors. Back in Flensburg, Dönitz received Jodl's message about Eisenhower's ultimatum. He sat in his headquarters, the weight of millions of lives on his shoulders. He made one final, duplicitous calculation. He authorized Jodl to sign the unconditional surrender. But he also gave secret, contradictory orders. German forces in the West would stop fighting immediately, obeying the surrender. But German forces facing the Soviets were ordered to continue resistance as long as possible. It was a race against the clock. Every hour the Eastern Front held meant thousands more soldiers and civilians could flee across the demarcation line. Every hour bought life. Dönitz needed to buy as many hours as possible before the Americans realized he was cheating. The German Navy was ordered to accelerate evacuations across the Baltic Sea. Operation Hannibal, already the largest naval evacuation in history, went into overdrive. Using everything from cruise liners to coal barges, the German Navy rescued between 1 and 2 million soldiers and civilians from the closing Soviet trap in East Prussia and the Baltic states. It would continue until the last possible moment, often under heavy Soviet air attack. Dönitz was playing a dangerous double game. He would give Eisenhower the piece of paper he demanded, but he would ignore its requirement for a simultaneous ceasefire on all fronts. At 2:41 a.m. on May 7, 1945, inside the schoolhouse in Reims, General Jodl signed the instrument of surrender. The room was silent, save for the scratching of the pen and the clicking of cameras. The war in Europe was officially over. Except it wasn't. The clock was still running. German units kept fighting in the east for 2 more days, ignoring the document Jodl had just signed. Stalin was furious when he learned about the Reims surrender. His spies and generals informed him exactly what the Germans were doing, surrendering to the West while shooting at the Soviets. He saw it as a betrayal by his allies and a trick by the Germans. He demanded a second surrender ceremony. This one would not be in a French schoolhouse. It would take place in the heart of the beast Berlin at Soviet headquarters, with Soviet commanders presiding. He wanted the world to see German officers submitting specifically to Soviet authority. On May 8th, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, the head of the German armed forces, was flown to Berlin. In a hall in the suburb of Karlshorst, decorated with Soviet flags, Keitel signed the surrender again. Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov watched him with a look of triumph and contempt. The signing happened late on May 8th, but in Moscow, due to the time difference, it was already past midnight. This is why the West celebrates victory in Europe on May 8th, while the Soviet Union and now Russia celebrates Victory Day on May 9th. Even the date of the peace became a point of conflict. Even then, German resistance continued in isolated pockets. Some units fought until May 11th, dying to buy time for last-minute evacuations. Dönitz's strategy had partially worked. Hundreds of thousands of German soldiers managed to cross the Elbe into American and British captivity before the final, absolute ceasefire took hold. Millions of civilians escaped the immediate zone of Soviet occupation. But the larger gamble the alliance had failed. There would be no Western crusade against Stalin. Eastern Europe would fall behind what Churchill would soon famously call the Iron Curtain. For those who didn't escape, the nightmare was just beginning. Everything the German generals had warned Eisenhower about came true, and it happened with terrifying speed. Within months of the surrender, the Soviets began dismantling the fragile democracies of Eastern Europe. They installed communist puppet governments in Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and East Germany. Poland's democratic leaders, who had fought the Nazis underground for years, were arrested, deported to Moscow, or executed. In Czechoslovakia, the non-communist foreign minister Jan Masaryk died in a suspicious fall from a window, a clear message to anyone who resisted. The free and fair elections promised at Yalta never happened. Opposition parties were banned. Secret police forces, modeled on the Soviet NKVD, rounded up anyone suspected of anti-communist sympathies. The Iron Curtain descended exactly where the German and Soviet forces had met in May 1945. It was a scar across the continent. 100 million people found themselves trapped behind it, trading one dictatorship for another. The German soldiers who had surrendered to the Soviets fared exactly as badly as Dönitz had predicted. They were shipped in cattle cars to the frozen wastes of the Soviet Union. Roughly 1 in 3 died in captivity from starvation, disease, and overwork. They became a lost generation. The last German POWs, approximately 10,000 men known as the late returnees, weren't released until October 1955. This release only happened after West German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer traveled to Moscow to beg for their freedom. 10 years after the war ended, these men stepped off trains in Friedland, Germany, into a country they no longer recognized. Their families had mourned them and moved on. Their children had grown up without fathers. They were ghosts of a war that Germany had spent a decade trying to forget, living reminders of the price paid for the failed negotiations in Reims. But by then, it was too late to do anything about the geopolitical reality. The map was set. In 1947, President Truman announced the Truman Doctrine, stating that the United States would oppose Soviet expansion anywhere in the world. The policy of containment had begun. In 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, was founded. The United States, Britain, France, and other Western nations formed a permanent military alliance against the Soviet threat. The alliance that Eisenhower had rejected 4 years earlier now existed just without Germany. Then came the ultimate irony. In 1955, a transformed West Germany democratic, denazified, and rebuilt under Allied supervision, was rearmed and admitted to NATO. The date of admission was May 9, 1955, exactly 10 years to the day after the Soviet-led surrender ceremony in Berlin. The Bundeswehr was officially established that November. This was not the Wehrmacht reborn. It was a new army under democratic civilian control, integrated into Western command structures. But many of its officers were men who had served in 1945. They remembered the proposal that had been refused. They remembered Jodl standing in the rain in Reims. The difference between 1945 and 1955 was 10 years of suffering and 100 million people trapped behind the Iron Curtain. The strategic logic Jodl presented had been sound. The Soviet Union was indeed the next great threat, but the timing had been impossible. The moral stain of the Nazi regime was too fresh, the crimes too horrific for the West to countenance an alliance in 1945. Dwight Eisenhower became President of the United States in 1953. He spent 8 years managing the dangerous freeze of the Cold War, a conflict that arguably might have been prevented, or at least fought differently, in 1945. He never publicly expressed regret about rejecting the German proposal. He maintained until his death that unconditional surrender to all allies was the only morally and politically acceptable outcome. To accept the German offer would have been to legitimize a criminal regime, but historians and strategists still debate the great what-if. By 1945, the Soviets were exhausted, their supply lines stretched thin, American air power was overwhelming, and American industry was untouched by bombs. The US possessed the atomic bomb, a weapon the Soviets wouldn't get for another 4 years. A confrontation then might have been winnable in ways that a confrontation later simply wasn't. All of them, Patton, Churchill, and even the desperate German generals, were proven right about Soviet intentions. Stalin had no intention of liberating Europe. He intended to conquer it. Whether they were right about the solution remains the great unanswered question of the 20th century. Would a war in 1945 have saved Eastern Europe, or would it have led to a catastrophe even worse than World War II? For the 100 million people trapped behind the Iron Curtain, the answer didn't matter. The theoretical debate meant nothing to them. The Berlin Wall went up, dividing families for decades. People were shot trying to cross from east to west, bleeding out in the death strip. Secret police monitored every whisper. Economies stagnated while the West boomed. Eisenhower hadn't said no to an alliance against the Soviets forever. He had effectively said wait. And that wait lasted 45 long, painful years until the wall finally fell. The proposal at Reims remains a chilling reminder of how the end of one war is often just the beginning of the next, and how the decisions made in a single room can sentence millions to decades of darkness.